Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Tom Day. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Courtauld Institute of Art and the organizer of this series, the second in our series of the moving image in American art practice and from the early 20th century through to now, basically. We've got a great roster of programming coming up. We've got another lecture coming on Thursday where myself will be giving a talk on the relationship between television and art in the East Village scene in the 1980s. And we have further events in May and June, and this is the second in our series. And we're really excited to invite Professor Catherine Manthorn from the City University of New York will be speaking to us about early silent cinema and its relationship to painting in the early 20th century. And she'll be responded to this evening by Professor Frances Fow of the University of Edinburgh. So what I'll do is just introduce both of our speakers, then we'll have, the way the program will run was we'll have Catherine give her talk for around 45 minutes, and then Frances will respond to the talk for circa 10 minutes, and then we will have opened up to a Q&A from the audience. So please, if you have questions, do put them in the chat, and I'll go through afterwards with Frances and Catherine, and we can discuss some of the broader issues that come out of the talk and of the response this evening. So I'm delighted, as I say, to welcome Catherine Manthorn. She's Professor of Art of the United States and Latin American Art and their cross currents, 1750 to 1950, at the City University of New York. She lectures and publishes widely on the art and film dynamic, including her most recent monograph, Film and Modern American Art, The Dialogue Between Cinema and Painting, which came out 2 years ago from Routledge and is recently available in paperback, and several related essays on issues related to the topic of art and film and the interrelation between them, including Mexican muralism and moving pictures, John Sloan's cinematic eye, experiencing nature in early film, dialogues with Church's Niagara and Homer's seascapes, John Sloan, moving pictures and Celtic spirits, and Made in Mexico, modern art and the movies. She teaches art history at the Graduate Center in City University of New York. And responding to Catherine this evening will be Professor Frances Fow, who is Chair of 19th Century Art at the University of Edinburgh and Senior Curator of Art at the National Galleries of Scotland. She has curated numerous exhibitions on late 19th and early 20th century art and American art, including American Impressionism, A New Vision in 2014. And she's recently published an essay on cosmopolitanism and the Gilded Age for the Terra Foundation of American Art. And she is co-editor of a newly released and newly published anthology, Globalizing Impressionism, Reception, Translation, and Transnationalism, which was recently brought out with Yale University Press. So I'm delighted to have both speakers here and looking forward to a really vibrant and dynamic event on this fascinating interrelation between cinema and painting in the early 20th century. So I'd like to hand over to Catherine now, who will be giving a talk, and then Frances will be speaking afterwards. So thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that introduction. And for the invitation to speak to this group. I'm really excited to present this material, and I look forward to a lively discussion. I also want to thank Frances Fow for being my partner in crime and sort of talking to us at the end, engaging in dialogue, and of course, the Center for American Art at the Courtauld and the Terra Foundation for its basically ceaseless support of art of the United States. So here you can see my title, The Shop Girl in Silent Movies and Fine Art. And so just as by way of introduction, I wanted to talk for a minute about this interaction between movies and fine art. So between the 1890s and the 1930s, movie-going became an established feature of life in the United States. Artists were watching movies, film directors looked to the fine arts, and the membrane between these media was quite porous, allowing for open exchange. So here I want to analyze this moving and still pictures as a continuum. This demonstrates that these seemingly disparate media occupy the same kind of social and intellectual space, and allows us to identify many significant cross currents and parallels. So this investigation, as Tom said, confines itself to the silent era. So basically from the earliest so-called invention of film in the 1890s to 1927, when the jazz singer burst upon the scene with sound. So this is the period that we're looking at. And as I'm sure many of you on this presentation know, the silent era has really come in for increasing attention, but especially that attention has focused largely on Euro-American males, people like D.W. Griffith in the silent era or Cecil B. DeMille. But more recently, women directors have begun to receive attention. So this, I think, is a really exciting moment because women were really cinematic pioneers. If you think about it, there were more women involved in Hollywood in its first 2 decades than there have been at any time since. The first woman to direct a film was almost certainly this woman I'm showing you here, Ellis Ghislaine, who first had a successful career in Paris at Gaumont, where she first made a 1-minute movie in 1896 called The Cabbage Fairy, and she continued to work for them until 1906, when she made a 30-minute film about the life of Christ. Then she came to the United States and she set up this company Solax, which was her company. And here you can see these are just 2 images from movies that she created. And she continued to make films then throughout the silent era into the 1920s. Another woman I wanted to mention who's even less known than the previous one was Helen Gardner. She actually formed her own company. She starred in her own movies. And here you can see she made her first release was a 6-reel movie about Cleopatra in 1913, in which she starred. So here she is here. And of course, deliberately selecting this very strong woman as her movie sort of vehicle. And of course, most people know Mary Pickford. In 1916, she set up her own company, taking full control of all her films thereafter. So pretty remarkable. And in 1919 was actually instrumental in founding Universal Pictures. So between 1912 and 1919, Universal Pictures had 11 female directors on its books. And together, those 11 women made 170 films. So after 1927, it did not credit a single female director until 1982, when Amy Heckerling made Fast Times in Ridgemont High. So it's a pretty interesting moment to be looking at women directors. So into that distinguished company, the name Lois WEBer stands out. After getting her start with Guy Blanchet, WEBer made a series of remarkable movies that put her literally on par. People talked about her in the same breath with Griffith and Cecil B. DeMille. Her most important and lasting impact really came in her social problem films made between about 1914 and 1921, which took courageous stands on very controversial issues, as we'll see. So noted for their artistry as well as their realism, her films really raised the status of moviegoing. If you think about it, from their very early days in 1896 until she came on the scene, movies were really aimed more at the lower classes. Respectable people really didn't go to the movies. So she helped to really change the whole tenor of movies. So delivering this talk today is especially timely, I think, since, as many of you know, last night was the Academy Awards, where Chloe Zhao won Best Director for Nomadland. So this made her only the 2nd woman and the first Asian woman in 93 years of Oscar history to win an award. So this was a really important moment. And I don't know if any of you, if you think back on your Oscar history, if anyone knows the first woman to win the prize, but I should probably just mention that was Catherine Bigelow for The Hurt Locker in 2010. So today I'd like to unpack the multiple dimensions of one silent movie made by WEBer in 1916. And here is the image on the left that you can see here, the opening credit, Mary McLaren in Shoes. So this was a movie about a 5-and-dime clerk named Eva Meyer. And so unable to afford decent footwear, Eva succumbs to male advances. And as we'll see in the text, the quote is used, "sold out for a pair of shoes." So I put WEBer's movie making in dialogue with the visual arts of her day, considering her in the light of female painters like Elizabeth Sparhawk Jones, and also the Ashcan painters, including John Sloan and others. So in this promotional photograph that you can see on the screen now, she's shown with her husband, Philip Smalley. And there's a kind of debate about how much the two of them, the nature of their collaboration. Initially, they seem to be working closely together, but her biographer, Shelley Stamp, and others have argued that by the time that she made Shoes, she was a little bit more in control. She was the daughter of a deeply religious family and a veteran of the church army workers, which I guess was sort of like the Salvation Army. Lois WEBer saw film not only as entertainment, but as a medium. Essentially, she called it like a pulpit for preaching about important social issues. In 1913, she wrote a lecture. She gave a lecture called "The Making of Picture Plays That Will Have an Influence for Good on the Public Mind." And in there, she describes her use of film as what she calls, quote, "a voiceless message to carry out the idea of missionary pictures." Her films addressed, such a range of topics: abortion, birth control, capital punishment, religious hypocrisy, a living wage, child labor, prostitution, and white slavery. And after she made this movie, Shoes, she made another movie called The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, which was actually a tribute to Margaret Sanger and her ideas on birth control. So she was very much an early auteur, you might say. She always wrote the films that she directed. Early on, she starred in them. And it's really her ideas that seem to be conveyed in her different movies. So she's at the height of her sort of powers in this period that we're looking at, the 19-teens. And she continues to work through the 1920s, but almost later is completely forgotten. So as I'm sure many of you know, this is partly because a lot of these movies got lost. We don't have a record of many of the movies she made except in print. But thanks to intense research, valiant restoration efforts, and some good luck, examples of her work have been saved and circulated. So as more movies become available, of course, interest has grown and scholars have examined her in greater depth. So as I mentioned, Shelley Stamp in 2015 produced the monographic study entitled Lois WEBer in Early Hollywood. And in 2019, a man named Martin Norden, a scholar named Martin Norden, published his compilation of all the different interviews and lectures that she gave. So drawing upon these important sources, I want to look more at the pictorial dimension of her work. So in order to tease out these arresting formal strategies in film that overlap with contemporary still pictures, and to highlight their mutual social message, I basically divided into 4 different sections. So this is the first one, Shop Girls. Then we'll look at shoes and shoe shops, the urban geography of the working class lives of women, and what I call celluloid sensorium, the idea of engaging the 5 senses. So I have one proviso here. I am not showing movie clips. Sometimes they get messed up on Zoom, but also I think it's sort of annoying to watch a movie and have someone talk over it the whole time when you actually want to watch the movie. So I would just direct you that on YouTube, you can find a full copy of Shoes, and also there's a wonderful DVD from Milestone. So female reformers argued that economic independence was just as important as being able to go to vote, for women to vote. And so they worked to improve employment opportunities. Women began seeking jobs as seamstresses, factory workers, teachers, and shop girls as they joined the workforce in increasing numbers. Isabel Bishop painted the attendants and customers in department stores on New York's 14th Street. Many other artists looked at that. In movies too, this became a big theme. The attractive saleswoman became a film staple, especially in the 1920s. And there's a movie by Norma Talmadge called Within the Law, in which the shop girl is unjustly accused of stealing and then is sent to jail. So it was a big theme in a lot of the movies of the 20s. And here I'm just showing you probably the most popular one. This is Clara Bow from 1927, reached the height of her sort of fame in this movie called It. And she was often called the It Girl, but here she plays Betty Lou Spence, who is a clerk, and you can see her there. She is in the center with her white collar. and her modern hairdo, a clerk who is asked on a date by the manager, who also happens to be heir to the department store. So the whole story unfolds, and that was a frequent theme in movies, that idea of that you would meet the owner or the manager, and he would sweep you off your feet and your life would totally change. But here you can see Betty Lou with her lace collar, standing with her coworkers behind the counter. So this movie from the 20s kind of highlights the idea of sexual mores that Clara Bow and other stars at the time also played out off screen. But the popularity of this theme in the visual culture, I think, of the 20s had its roots basically earlier in people like WEBer. So that we'll look at a little bit more closely this movie by WEBer. So what you're seeing here are the two opening shots from the movie, and we'll talk about them in a second. So social reformer Louise de Koven Bowen studied underpaid department store girls, as she says, quote, surrounded by and selling the luxury they crave for wage compensation inadequate for a life of decency and respectability. So she's talking about commodification of the objects, but also in a way of the women. So taking this argument further, Jane Addams, the famous reformist, published this book called A New Conscience and an Ancient Evil. And you can see WEBer certainly gives homage to Jane Addams by actually showing the book here. So she's sensitive to the plight. WEBer herself was sensitive to the plight of the young women because her work with the Christian Army had brought her in touch with many of these people. So she was so inspired by the work of Addams that she actually uses this quote, when the shoes become too worn to endure a third soling, and she possesses but 90 cents towards a new pair, she gave up the struggle. And to use her own contemptuous phrase, she sold out for a new pair of shoes. So this is the start of the movie. Supplementing Addams' political treatise with a short story by Stella Wynn Heron, published in January of 1916 in Collier's magazine, WEBer wrote the script for Shoes. She dramatizes the dilemma of Eva Meyer, a poorly paid shop girl supporting not only herself, but her three sisters, her mother, and her father, who actually refuses to work. So with decent clothes or footwear impossible on her meager salary, she felt forced to accept the advances of men with dishonorable intentions. So this is the sort of basic plot line. So Ashcan artist William Glackens turned his attention to this new phenomenon because, think about it, in the late 19th century, shopping was really reinvented. It was no longer this straightforward financial transaction. You know, we need this thing, we will buy this one thing. It becomes a source of diversion, delight, and of course, temptation. So here in this painting, you can see in the center, this is actually Glackens' wife. He used her as a model in this fur coat, and her companions, her shopping companions. And you can see they look very forceful. They're sort of taking up the whole space of the foreground, and the poor shop girl in the distance here in the background is sort of looking a bit intimidated and trying to accommodate them as best she can. Elizabeth Sparhawk Jones's early work often represented women in the modern city, nursemaids at home, women strolling in the park, and shoppers and store clerks were her subjects. For working class women, shop work kind of opened up a new avenue because it was considered certainly more respectable than manual labor, but not quite completely respectable. So mostly this entailed women standing behind the counter, selling things to other women. But when you think about it, Sparhawk Jones, Glackens, there's only so much of a story they can tell in a single image. So to look into the lives of these women in a little bit more depth, we really need to turn to WEBer. So here's a shot from the movie. You can see this is Eva here, her friend Lil, and Charlie, the kind of man who's going to make advances. So the shop girl was expected to dress respectably, projecting a positive image. And as the employment manuals of the day said, standing, smiling, and serving. That was what was expected. But of course, the reality was somewhat different. Sometimes they could actually dress in clothes borrowed from the store. Or in Eva's case, she has this is the one decent outfit that she has to keep washing over and over. And you can imagine this is quite an exhausting ordeal, standing behind the counter for the entire workday, often that stretched for quite a long hours. They were not allowed to sit down at all, even if there was no customer there. And then remind ourselves too that the lighting technology is changing. So by this time, stores are staying open later to catch people coming home from work. So their day could sometimes be 11 hours or even as long as 15 hours long with only a half hour for lunch. So, and they were paid just a pittance. So we see in the movie at one point, Eva is in line with her fellow workers waiting for her envelope with her wages, which was $5 for this entire 6-day work week. So the living conditions, of course, that they could afford on such an amount were meager indeed. You know, they would share rooms with several people. Some of the department stores even had dormitories where they forced the girls to live in order to extort more money out of them. Or in Eva's case, she's living with her mother, father, her 3 sisters, and she even has to share a bed with her sister. But this is there's one other significant point to be considered. Because the shop girls were behind the counters and they were more visible in these stores than, say, a factory worker or a seamstress, their labors became more widely known. And so therefore, of course, their problems became more widely known. So this is a cover by John Sloan from the journal The Masses, which of course was a very, a very progressive organ at the time. And you can see he's showing the shop girls coming home from work. So they tended to be in the forefront of progressive movements that work to change the labor laws and to get more wage equity because they were, better known to the public. So this helps, I think, to explain their frequent appearance in paintings and movies and other things because they just had this greater visibility. So WEBer, we know, made a point of anchoring all her narratives in real places. And here you can see this one was actually filmed at the Woolworths, which was located on Broadway in Los Angeles. So shooting on location, she assures that this trademark facade would be prominent and familiar. We don't think of it so much today, maybe because this chain is closed, but the chain of stores at the time was the first brand to go global and replicated a nearly identical storefront in almost 5,000 cities around the globe. So given that WEBer's movies are also circulating not only all over the United States, but internationally, this means that this facade would be international, instantly recognizable to audiences. We know that she's working this Woolworths. So Eva is not working in any old shop. Think about the Sparhawk Jones. We didn't know exactly where that was set. But in the case of Eva, we know that she's at the Woolworths. So what does this mean for Eva and other shop girls to be employed by Woolworths? Well, first of all, you can see that there are fixed prices. So here is the 10-cent sign, the 5-cent sign. Everything has these fixed prices. They sold only factory-made goods that were made, for a mass market at rock bottom prices. So, nothing handmade. This is factory stuff. And the customers, largely women, would mill around, pick out what they wanted, and then bring it back to the counter where people like Eva would ring up their sales. This is work by Glackens of the Shop Girls. Again, another cover for the masses, just again, celebrating the single woman. They seem to be all kind of part of one united front moving forward. They seem to be independent, making their own decisions, and heading out after work into the world of popular entertainment. But Eva's circumstances, as we see over and over again in this movie, are quite different from most of these people. So in the early days, stores like the one Eva worked in generated great riches so that its founder was able to erect what was in 1913 the tallest building in the world. And he hired Cass Gilbert, who was the go-to architect at the time, to create this building, which still stands in New York City. And we know that he actually paid cash for this building, a whopping $13.5 million. So clearly he's raking in a fair amount of money. And part of the reason he was able to do this, of course, was advertising and just plate glass windows, shop windows that really attracted people. So we know Eva, once she comes out of work, and her friend Lil that you see here also, they go by the shop windows, they see the different things they'd like to be able to get. And of course, Eva every day is walking by, looking at this pair of shoes that she wants. On the right, I'm showing you John Sloan, his picture shop window, and you can see too that he's dealing with this idea of the consumers coveting these objects in the windows. And of course, again, with the advances in lighting, these people are able to stroll the streets at night. And so this just keeps going on. They get out of work and they in a shop, and they go up and look in the windows of other shops. So this is the reality of this world at the time. So the next section I wanted to talk about is shoe shops and shoes. So in earlier centuries, as we'll see, the people who worked in shops were male. And this is a 17th century, early 17th century etching from a series of trades. And I love this image because you can see the man here is stooping to help the woman with the shoe. But this seems to be a little bit more going on than just trying shoes. He seems to be sort of fondling her foot a little bit. And you can see other images on the back wall that suggest this idea as well. So these shops become places for kind of a little bit of hanky-panky, we might say. This is another one. The rakish man hands a love letter to a woman here again in the shoe shop. You can see the shoes hanging. And on the left, this is the actual letter that this man is delivering. And then this is a really fun movie. This is on the Library of Congress website, so you should go and look at it. It's called The Gay Shoe Clerk. So this is the sort of narrative here. First, the young woman comes in and she's chaperoned by her mother, and the male clerk is trying on the shoe. And you can see over here, she's slowly picking up her skirt so that he gets a little bit more of a look at her leg. He takes the bait and he lunges over and gives her a kiss. The mother looks shocked and she starts whacking him. So this is, just a short movie, but it gives you the idea again of that shoe shops, shoes, this is a common theme. But the other point I wanted to make was this was made by Edwin Porter, who worked for Edison at the time, and later WEBer works with him. So she's probably aware of these different movies that have to do with shoes. And of course, it's not just what you see in the plate glass windows. There's advertising in every magazine you look in. So shoes start to move from being just an absolute necessity. A person has maybe one pair of shoes or possibly two, but especially in this period, you get more and more of this idea that shoes are an accessory and that you need them for different occasions and to go with different kinds of clothing. So this is, all part of this consumer culture in which Eva is trapped. So let's look now at Sparhawk Jones's shoe shop from 1911. So this is sort of the pendant to the one we were looking at before of the shop girls. And you can see on the right here, this detail, which is in the lower left corner of her painting, that shows the actual shoes. So you can see she has that loose brush stroke that she learned from her teacher, William Merritt Chase. And so it gives this idea of a very bustling environment. You can imagine these women come rushing in, all excited about looking at shoes and want their shop girls to go and run and get their what they want to try on. We know also that Sparhawk Jones was studying at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. So she would have been right in the neighborhood of the Wanamaker department store. And although we don't know exactly where she was looking for the shoe department, that might have been one place, very likely, where she observed these female customers. So here's just a blow up of it. I wanted to just probe a few more details. You can see that Sparhawk Jones has done, a few sort of visual tropes to try to make sure that you know who's who here. The shop girls are in the foreground. They are hatless. The shoppers who have come in have much, fancier hats, suits on. The shop girls wear their shirtwaist dresses, but you can also see that they're lower in the field, their heads are lower, and they're, sort of subservient. So giving this idea that this is the kind of hierarchy of what's going on in this environment. But anyway, we begin to then see that we have to look back to the movie. And you can see here, Eva is, shoes have been so deteriorated that the upper portion of them is in tatters. Here's her shoe right here. And then the sole is such a thin veneer of leather that there are frequent holes in them, that she's basically, her skin is always exposed to the street or to the unforgiving floor service at the store. So there are at least 3 different scenes interspersed over the course of this 1-hour movie where we can see Eva going through the same ritual. You can see on the lower right here, she has a cardboard box. She keeps these cardboards in her drawer of her bureau. Every night she takes them out. She traces the shoe onto the cardboard, cuts out the cardboard, and inserts it into her shoe. So this is the way in which she, again and again, we see her taking a piece of cardboard, doing this over and over again. So the repetition emphasizes the increasing pain and frustration that she's undergoing. Then we see every week she comes home, she gives her envelope, her salary envelope to her mother. Her mother takes out the money. She says, "Ma, you said I could have $3 for the shoes." She said, "Not this week, I can't afford it, but next week." So this goes on in an excruciating way, week after week. And finally, we see, before Eva does probably, that she's not going to get the shoes that her mother promises. So increasingly in this period, directors used close-ups. Close-up shots were, increasingly effective way to make certain points, but mostly they would zero in on heads and facial expressions. But here again, WEBer deviates from the norm and engaged in close scrutiny of everyday objects that often go unnoticed. So one of the ways we know anything about what WEBer was doing is that we have different kinds of accounts of people that observed her on the set. And one visitor writes as follows: "This famous woman producer and director also told me that she makes an intensive study of feet. We've all lived through the photographer's arrangement of our hands, but few of us have experienced posing the feet. That is what Lois WEBer does. She wants to idealize every commonplace thing, wants to bring beauty and artistic finish into even the smallest part of the camera work." So building on this interest, the movie uses close-ups of feet to great effect. So in this shot, you can see Eva has been sitting on a park bench during her lunch break, and she looks over and sees this group of women get out of a car, very well-dressed women who are going to probably go shopping for more things. But you can see all their boots are so beautiful, their feet look so nice, and then she looks down at her own shoes here. So she begins to think, okay, this is hopeless, I've got to do something. So here she is sitting on the park bench, and this was at the time called Central Park in Los Angeles. And you can see the fountain here in the back is, I kind of imagine that this is sort of a phallic symbol, that as she's looking at these shoes of these other women, she's starting to think, okay, maybe I do have to go along with Charlie. She looks down at her own feet again, and there seems to be a certain determination that this is what she's going to end up doing. And I should say this park is now called Pershing Square. So again, there's this sort of sense of wanting to show things, give them verisimilitude by actually shooting on these different locations that are well known to her audiences, at least in California. So anyways, to continue then, I wanted to talk a little bit about so what is the city that these women are circulating through? So here I want to establish a few different confluences between the different scenes and shoes and a group of contemporary artists, especially the Ashcan artists. And we should, of course, acknowledge that WEBer, as I was saying, was shooting in Los Angeles, while the Ashcan artists are, of course, based in New York. But there are certain aspects of urban geography, and especially tenements, that sadly give them a kind of continuity. So here is just the first comparison. You can see this is the stairway going up to Eve's apartment on the left, and on the right, this is the work of John Sloan, who created pictures from everyday life, as we know, observing the New York streets. And he talks, during this whole period of around 1905 to through the teens, he's keeping a diary. So we know that he mentions different things that he wants to paint. So he was, as he put it, in the habit of watching every bit of human life I can see about my windows. but I do it so that I am not observed at all. So in other words, a bit of a voyeur. So he develops this picture on the right from a pencil sketch of observing these scrawny cats, which again become a symbol of these tenements. And you can see the garbage can in Eva's hallway on the right has also the scrawny cat. So both WEBer and Sloan are sort of looking at subjects that other people haven't really paid attention to, and in a way sort of championing the underclass. Both the shot from WEBer and Sloan also emphasizes this idea of what we might call kitchen sink realism. WEBer rejected the idea of using, building a set at the studio and shooting there. She would go out into the city streets and find a tenement apartment that she wanted to use as a set and, arrange with the owner to be able to use it. She even insisted that, say, for example, she's cooking this cabbage here, that the cabbage that was on the set had to be cooked on this cooktop that was in the apartment. So she's kind of a stickler for realism. And at the same time, so is Sloan. So he writes in his diary in April of 1909, a good day's work, painting the subject that has been in my mind for some weeks. I have been watching a curious 2-room household, 2 women, and I think 2 men. Their day begins at midnight. They cook at 3 a.m. So the painting is called 3 a.m. So his scene you can see here of these sort of underdressed women shocked contemporary audiences. And in fact, this painting was rejected by the exhibition jury, who seemed to assume that these women were actually prostitutes. So again, Eva's father, sits around all day, smoking his pipe, reading his penny dreadfuls, and swilling beer. That all this leaves Eva to be the main breadwinner of her family. But her mother does try to stretch a dollar and to take in work when she can. So this kind of housework, as they called it, was done by women who had children. She could mind her own children, but at the same time, take in other people's laundry. So you can see here on the left, again, the water boiling on the stove. She's washed the clothes, and now she's struggling to wring them dry in the center of the composition. And on the right, you can see it's almost as though Sloan has picked up where WEBer left off. You can see this woman sort of precariously balanced on this fire escape here, reaching out to hang out the clothes on this clothesline that's tied between 2 buildings. And you probably can't see too well, but again, Sloan's attention to detail, she actually has a clothespin stuck in her mouth. So we know that she'll, then pull it out and be able to hang up the next bit of clothing. So both of them are looking at these different activities and using them as the subject for their work. Sloan's Haymarket then on the right was regarded as provocative because it showed these ostentatiously dressed women entering the dance hall by themselves without male companions. So they're defying society's expectations. In Shoes on the left, there's a parallel scene where women are entering the Blue Goose, where Eva's friend, so quote unquote friend Charlie, sings in a quartet as people dance. So not only the subject matter, but in a way the treatment is a shock to many viewers who expected much more genteel kinds of subjects and scenery. And note too that in both cases, there's on the right, Sloan shows a sort of bouncer in his white shirt. And on the left, we can see a kind of doorman. But both of these gentlemen are on the lookout for women who are entering this space on their own and sort of trying to hook up with men who would be their potential customers. And finally, in this series of comparisons, I wanted to show that, WEBer and Sloan both seem to be thinking very hard about the whole idea of the impact of cinema on, immigrant and working class people. Because think about it, if it's a silent movie, there wasn't a language barrier. People from Poland, Germany, Mexico, China, they could all pile into the theater, pay their nickel, and watch these different movies. So Sloan on the left, you can see is showing this group gathering around the movie facade. And on the right, this is again really interesting. WEBer did this movie called Idle Wives. And within Idle Wives, she inserts another one of her earlier movies, Life's Mirror. So you can see people are filing into the movie. And then here on the sandwich board is her husband, Philip Smalley, who starred in the movie. So they're thinking about movies as a social institution. So finally, in this last section, this is a little bit more speculative. I was, just watching a handful of WEBer's films that are currently available out of the 100-something that she made. I find them continually compelling. I often ask myself, how exactly did she do that? What makes them so? In the case of shoes, the plot line is relatively simple, right? Many young women probably experienced a similar fate to Eva's. So I want to suggest here that perhaps the whole idea of WEBer's forcing us to identify with Eva Meyer's circumstances literally by weaving a cinematic net that draws us into her routine by engaging all of the 5 senses. So here's just one example of 17th century Dutch. Another French artist named Mercier, this was a common trope in paintings and in prints, doing a series of the 5 senses. So looking at paintings, watching movies, of course, sight is the main sense that's being appealed to. Silent movies we think of as silent, but of course, at the time in WEBer's day, there was music that was played throughout the run of the movie, and WEBer, we know, actually would consult with the musicians at the different theaters in order to have a sense of what kind of music was going to be played during her movie. So I think I'm trying to argue then that she's effectively appealing to the other 3 senses: smell, taste, and touch. So here you see a screenshot of the Meyer family meal of the cabbage flavored with a little bit of corned beef. So throughout the movie, there's an emphasis on the lack of proper food, on the meagerness of their meals, and of any accommodation they try to make to enhance the sense of taste. Pots sit perpetually on the stove, stewing fibrous cabbage to make it even slightly palatable. They try to negotiate, to credit it with the butcher, to get a little bit of meat to flavor it. And then all of a sudden in the movie, the butcher cuts off the credit. He says, until Mr. Meyer gets a job, no more credit. So at that point, the daughter number 2, I should say, finally protests. She says, "Mama, we haven't tasted meat in a week." So that's the intertitle. She doesn't say, as most I think would, "We haven't had meat." She says, "Mama, we haven't tasted it." So WEBer, we know, was also vigilant about the intertitle cards. She would write them all herself and even fashion the type of lettering that she wanted to use. So here again, her work is an evidence. She's calling attention to the impact of poverty on the Meyer children, who are deprived of even the basic pleasure derived from food, from the sense of taste. So here you can see Mr. Meyer has come to the table to eat here you see the cabbage. And even here, he brings his penny dreadful and he props it up on the sugar pot, and he doesn't even pay any attention at all to his family. So in the meantime, the mother, we see the same ritual going on over and over. She has a little can of evaporated milk. She takes it to the sink and dilutes it with water, with tap water, to make it stretch further. And so when nobody's looking, daughter number 3 adds sugar to her cup. So again, she's hardly enhancing the nutritional value, but she's hoping to improve its flavor. So WEBer over and over avoids, she could just say, oh, they had a meager meal, or they're very poor, but rather she situates us, the viewers, at the table with them, and we sort of experience this quotidian ritual that they go through. With poor ventilation and the eternal stench of boiled cabbage, working class tenements had a distinctive odor. Those cooking smells and rotting garbage were all, permeated the hallways and made it very distinctive. This is literally the smell of poverty that civic leaders at the time associated with a lack of hygiene. So here I'm just showing you again that same shot on the left that we saw before of the garbage can with the cat. And on the right, this is a work by George Bellows. When their group of painters was dubbed the Ashcan School, he does this work called The Disappointment of the Ashcan, and you can see that he's kind of smelling this food that's been in the garbage can. So we know, again, how did WEBer really convey this? Well, there's this whole scene when Eva comes home from work on Saturday night and she's sort of trudging up the stairs very slowly. We might think that, okay, it's Saturday, you've been working all week, you might want to go a little faster to get home and be in the sanctuary of your dwelling. But instead, she walks more slowly, her face is frozen in this grimace. And then we see the intertitle that says that, before she got to the door, she smells all these cooking odors, and she's sort of bracing herself for this encounter with her family. I did just want to show you a couple of other images that are kind of fun, just to see the way shoes were worked into different movies at the time. This is a very famous sort of sequence in Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush. His character, the little tramp, goes off to the Yukon to try to strike it rich. But of course he doesn't strike it rich. So he is so desperate that he's actually boiling his shoes to compose a meal. And here you can see the sort of shoe looks like a bit of a turkey carcass or something with the nails sticking up like bones. And there's a whole sequence where he pulls out the shoelaces and eats it like spaghetti. So there's, shoes are used in very inventive ways in these different movies. This is Harry Carey in soft shoes, and he's under the bed hiding. And you can see this other, the woman, Lillian Rich's character walks in and he can see her shoes. So shoes are signifiers in a way that, like we can tell something about the person from the kind of shoe they're wearing, but no one seems to use it quite the way WEBer does. So touch is probably the most critical of the five senses in this movie, especially the tactile sensations that come through the feet. And in fact, I think it's quite astounding how much WEBer makes us aware of our feet, both the pleasure and the pain that they can feel. So using unusual camera shots and innovative framing, feet and shoes become the focus of this movie. So early on, you saw the Eva's worn out shoes that kind of make you cringe. But as the movie goes on, she comes out of her apartment one day and it's pouring rain. She has no umbrella, no proper raincoat or wellies or anything else. And this is where I think WEBer really grabs our attention. So there's this whole tracking shot, which I tried to replicate here. You can see the lower right, it starts out her boots clear, and she's walking through this rain, sloshing through puddles. And so we can literally feel the cold, dirty water seeping into her shoe through the soggy, disintegrating cardboard. And then we're told at the end of the sequence, when she finally gets to work, that it rained for several more days. So then she gets behind the counter. As if she hasn't endured enough, all of a sudden we see her wincing and she turns over her foot and we see that a nail has gone through the foot, through the sole of the shoe and into her foot. And so she, extracts it. So interestingly, this movie basically got a lot, mostly positive reviews, but people singled out this one scene. They said WEBer had gone too far. This scene was too graphic. And, if you think of some of the different kinds of scenes that are shown even in the silent movies, it's pretty remarkable that this was the one that was thought of as being the most graphic. The physical abuse drives Eva towards Charlie. So she determines to go to the Blue Goose to meet up with him. So upon entering, again, the camera moves to her feet. So we can see again her boots here. But now she's standing on carpeting. So it's almost as though now we're feeling the same thing she must have, the signal that she's entered into this pleasure palace, and also the warning of the sexual encounter that's to follow. So now let's look at the touch through the hands of the actors. Charlie's touch carries a message of his erotic intentions. Initially, we see him in the store. He sort of reaches over and touches her hand and she pulls away quite quickly. Another time they encounter each other on the street, he shakes her hand, but he's, kind of lingers too long holding her hand. And again, she pulls away in dread. But now she's sitting in the Blue Goose waiting for him. And you can see he's put his hand on her shoulder and here is these rings on his hand. It just looks sort of grasping. So the screen then fades to black and his subsequent actions are understood. And afterwards, here are the new boots that Eva acquires. So the lingering shot of the grasping hand with these long fingers and bedecked with rings parallels, I think, this well-known shot of this hand of poverty hovering above Eva's head as she's trying to sleep. So the threat of the allegorical hand is more psychological in nature. Every night she's so worried about her family money for her family. But Charlie is a physical presence, and it will be a long time before she can forget the weight that his touch and the events that it put in motion. So the hands are contrasted. So to conclude then, movies in the teens when WEBer was at Universal were raw. They took risks. Sometimes I think we tend to think of the Keystone Cops or something as being the main type of movie that was being made. But in Shoes, the female protagonist must do wrong in order to feed her family in even the most meager manner. So in the finale scene, Eva comes home on Monday after her weekend encounter with Charlie. And her mother realizes the instant her daughter comes to the door, what has transpired. Eva, you can see, stands looking at the cracked mirror, but she's so ashamed, she really doesn't even make, kind of meet her own gaze. Her mother evidences sympathy. She doesn't seem to judge her daughter for succumbing to the desires of her male companion. And the movie ends as it began with a literary quote, basically sort of life must go on. So these conflicts, both physical and emotional, that the female protagonists face are meant to really impact the viewer deeply. This is not just something you watch for the story, but this is meant to affect social change. This is very much WEBer's idea about things. So it's of course challenging, I think, to insert WEBer into an intermediary dialogue with fine art for a variety of reasons. Her work in the end was more focused on social critique when the fine arts created at the same moment are not really being used as a social weapon in quite the same way. And of course, movies evolve through thousands of frames projected over time, while a painting, in a sense, is the equivalent of only a single frame of the film strip. Yet WEBer, Sloan, Sparhawk, Jones, and their cohort drew upon a shared visual culture to address the same subjects: immigration, poverty, labor, hardships, and the exploitation of women. So all of this indicates to me, and I hope it's convinced you, that there is something to be gained by putting movies in dialogue with fine art and to better understand what WEBer called their voiceless message. So it's the end.
Thank you, Cathy. That was absolutely fantastic. Oh, well, we're applauding now. It was brilliant. It was such a rich and many-layered lecture, and I learned a huge amount. And I have to admit that I was unfamiliar with Lois WEBer's work until I had the pleasure of reading your text, and it's really been an eye-opener for me. And I was tempted to go off and have a look on YouTube, but I only managed to find a very short snippet, I have to say, but I'm going to persevere.
Oh, okay. Maybe I should share a link with the longer one.
Yeah, that would be fantastic, actually. There are so many thought-provoking themes that emerge from your talk. I mean, from social inequality to obviously shoes, to synesthesia. But I mean, first and foremost, I was really struck by the fact that Lois WEBer's contribution and her importance as a filmmaker, like that of so many talented women, has been largely overlooked until very recently. And even now it seems to be overshadowed by better known male directors. So I mean, it is really wonderful. The kind of research that you're doing is really important. The second is the fact that she engaged with such challenging subject matter. And I'm really interested in the parallels that you draw, particularly with Elizabeth Sparhawk Jones, and also the Ashcan artists. I mean, for example, the comparisons you make with William Glackens are interesting in looking at them in relation to Sparhawk Jones. And obviously the parallels with John Sloan are very interesting and extremely thought-provoking. So we'll maybe come back to that later on. I just wanted to say a few words in response to the talk. Now, obviously, the shop girl's a key theme, and you make the interesting point that shopping was effectively reinvented around about the kind of late 19th century, and then opened up a whole new field of employment for working class women. It was obviously a period of huge social change, and but I just wanted to observe that it was also an opportunity for upper class women too, because it was a kind of period of greater empowerment for them, because they'd previously been sort of closeted in the home, in their gilded cages, as it were. And I mean, I think quite a bit's been written about this, about the idea of them kind of going out and buying things and sort of empowering themselves in the process. But anyway, that's just an observation. The subject of the shop girl was of course addressed at an earlier period, not necessarily by American artists, but by French artists such as Edgar Degas, who painted his famous series of milliners in the 1880s. And one of the most famous works of that period is Manet's Barque de Folie Bergère, which is in the Courtauld. And I think it rather cleverly captures this ambiguous position of the girls that you touch on, the fact that they're standing behind the counter and they're kind of on show, and they are as much, you know, for sale, as it were, as the products that they're selling, objects that they're selling. I was fascinated by your mention of the fact that they were never allowed to sit down. They worked such long hours. And I actually, in my youth, one of the first jobs I ever had was working as a shop girl, a vendeuse in a fashion store in Paris in the late 1970s. And exactly the same thing. We were never allowed to sit down. And I remember the agony and the boredom of being on your feet all day. So it really has huge resonances. Now, the shop girl was obviously a new subject for American women artists. And I mean, I know more about the, you know, kind of slightly earlier period. So artists like Mary Cassatt or Mary Fairchild McManus, who were much more kind of limited in their social spaces. And that seems to be something which was changing, hopefully, in the beginning of the 20th century, that women were actually allowed to venture forth a little bit more. They could frequent more than just what their upper class background dictated. So whereas someone like Mary Cassatt was limited to painting, you know, visits to the theatre, perhaps, or women making tea or taking tea, or perhaps nannies and wet nurses, you know, the artists of this next generation had more scope. I was reading a little bit about Sparhawk Jones, and it was interesting to see that she was at the MacDowell Artist Colony in New Hampshire at the same time as Lilla Cabot Perry, who's another interesting sort of pioneer of or representative of women artists at that time. But Perry also, she limited herself to women at leisure, so mainly kind of women making music or reading or writing, and that's so typical. And then another very prominent artist of that slightly earlier period, Cecilia Beau, she like many women contented herself with making portraits, you know, so was actually more commercially minded, because was one problem associated with this kind of new subject matter is that how, you know, who you're selling it to, who's your audience. The only artist I could think of that really addressed social inequality or the plight of the working classes at an earlier period was Elizabeth Nourse, who worked at Volendam in 1892, and so she did at least paint the lives of the rural poor weavers and fisherfolk, that kind of thing. So anyway, class is obviously a huge theme that emerges from the lecture, and Eva's social distance from her clients, perhaps also from even the other women that she worked with, is symbolized by her shoes, as you so eloquently discuss. So I just wanted to think a little bit about the painting by Sparhawk Jones of the shoe shop, because the distinction there is, as you say, made by hats rather than shoes. But I wonder whether she really insists on the difference in the same way that, you know, I really enjoyed the way that you characterize the difference between them, that the people entering the shop are sort of more at a higher level. They're wearing smart, sort of more fashionable clothes. But there's one figure right in the center of that painting who she is a client. She's wearing a hat, but she's also wearing what's I know we often refer to as rational dress. And she's wearing a walking dress, and she has a white top, and she's dressed all in black and white, in fact, like the shop girls. And she's even wearing a tie, a collar and tie, and her hair is hidden under her hat, so a bit like a new woman. And I wonder whether she's supposed to represent something which is kind of, you know, between the two, maybe. I don't know. This is something perhaps you could comment on later on. And the thing is that Lois WEBer and Elizabeth Sparhawk Jones were both effectively new women. They would still represent this new type of woman that was emerging at that time, who was very independent, career-minded, and it was a period when women were still campaigning for the vote. They didn't get the vote till 1920, I think I'm right, in the US. A lot of women artists were branded as new women because they had this these very successful careers, and were often unmarried. So WEBer, I was again interested in her relationship with her husband, because as you said, she seems to have been the one that was really in the driving seat there, and that he seems to have lived in her shadow rather than the other way around. So that's also must be fairly unusual, I imagine, at that time. You also mentioned the popularity of cinema among the working classes, but you said it was obviously changing at that time. But there were also a number of immigrants coming into, I think, into Los Angeles, but also into New York, and that's obviously a subject which is addressed by Ashcan artists to a great degree. There was a huge influx of migrants to the US generally in that whole period. And another artist that you might look at, I mean, you maybe have, I think you have looked at already actually, is Teresa Bernstein. And she addresses this sort of issue in works such as The Milliners, which is in the Art Institute of Chicago. And I'm sure you have looked at it. It shows a group of women sewing accessories on hats, and they're all crammed in a tiny apartment. And the idea is that maybe they are themselves, they could be Jewish immigrants, I don't know. But again, that might be something you might like to comment on. And then, of course, there were other women working around the same period who, people like Marjorie Ryerson, Margaret Law, Henrietta Shaw, who were depicting racial minorities. And some of these artists were pupils of Robert Henry, so that they were encouraged by his socialist beliefs to explore these sort of other themes. And I also thought about George Lukes, who features immigrant women vendors on the streets of Lower Manhattan in some of his paintings, around the same period. But John Sloan obviously is a brilliant comparison, and he too focused on the immigrant population, and you make some astonishing parallels in your talk between his paintings and Lois WEBer's films. I also think that her cinematic style seems to resonate with his slightly voyeuristic approach, which is kind of strange, isn't it? I don't know how he got away with that. But I was also interested in the fact that her heroine, having looked at a clip of Shoes, is that she's very introspective, and we're given an insight into her private thoughts and her anxieties. And the prolongation or the protraction of time in some scenes is really noticeable. And I wondered again if you'd maybe thought about drawing parallels with Edward Hopper, again, another artist who was very successful at that period. And I did also wonder actually whether she potentially had any influence on the later surrealists, because there's something almost fetishistic about this fixation on the shoes, isn't there, in some of the scenes, especially that you're showing at the end. So anyway, she's obviously, I feel that in contrast to Elizabeth Sparhawk Jones, she's Lois WEBer is much more kind of modern, and she's just making a much more important statement, really, in many ways. And that comes back to this the use of a different medium, and perhaps the fact that painting, they're perhaps aiming at a different audience, that you can say more through film, and that with Sparhawk Jones, she's limited to potentially a more elite audience, a more upper class audience. So that's why she's sort of more muted, perhaps, in her response. So the first question I wanted to ask you about actually, though, is about the audience, but it's also about whether these parallels with painting were what you really wanted to look at, or whether you also wanted to, and I know you have worked a lot on John Sloan, whether you wanted to look at print media as a parallel, because it had this different audience, wider audience potentially, and also so things like the kind of repetition that you find in film, you can replicate in print media, and I just wondered whether you'd actually looked at that at WEBer's films in relation to Sloan, for example, Sloan's prints, or whether that's not something which you want to pursue.
Oh, sure. Well, Sloan, of course, was very involved in print, making prints at the time, series of prints. He did one called the New York Life series that, actually does have a lot of points of contact with, or parallel at least with WEBer's work and other films. But I just, for the purposes of this presentation, I became kind of compelled myself by some of the different paintings that did seem to have such a specific resonance with her images. And, the fact that Sparhawk Jones sold her work. Sloan was, often, he actually called himself the best known artist who never sold anything. So he was known, and he would submit these works, they would be rejected, and people would know about this and know about the image. So he became a bit of a personality almost, as well as just a painter for sort of being out there with these images. And he makes a distinction himself. He says that in his paintings he's not making as much of a social commentary as he does obviously as for the cover of the Masses or even for his prints. So I guess I should have made the point more strongly that I thought even in these cases where he's not really trying to be as political or make such a strong social statement, we can still tease that out when we look at it in relation to WEBer. So that was kind of one of the things that interested me there.
Yeah.
But when you were talking about WEBer herself and her being more of a modern woman than say someone like Sparhawk Jones, again, I didn't, spend a lot of time on this subject, but, in a lot of their early, well, first of all, her husband starts out a bit more successful in movies earlier than she does. So she starts working with him and he sort of brings her along, but then she becomes the bigger force. But also in all their interviews, anytime she ever talked to the press, she would make a point of being with her husband side by side and emphasizing their collaboration and the fact that they always agreed on. So she almost used him as a bit of a shield, I think, to try to push her own agenda. But then the united front that she and her husband had gave her, in a funny way, some protection about some of the ideas that she was presenting there. He also was much more cultured. She came from more Western Pennsylvania. She worked for the church mission there that was sort of like the Salvation Army. So she came from a slightly different background than her husband, who was much more educated. She talks about the fact that my husband knew people like Whistler, so he knew some of the art. So again, I didn't go through all that here, but I think some of her awareness of the fine arts and the books that they would reference and things, images they would reference was partly because of him initially. So it's hard to tease it all out. And even people who've written whole books about her haven't really teased it all out. But it's just there are so many different ways to consider these artists and WEBer that but she's endlessly fascinating, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously it's a very rich area, and I think there's a lot of potential to develop it even further. I was going to ask you one more question before handing over to Tom, which is a more general question actually. And it concerns something you said right at the very beginning, which was about the women directors in the silent era. So why do you think there were so many up to 27 and then this silence afterwards? With the onset of the talkies, can you explain why that happened?
Well, I think part of it was because, it was a new medium. Nobody studied nobody went to film school, right? Nobody had the edge. So women as well as men could gravitate towards this new medium. And, just sort of, it didn't have any rules. It didn't have any boundaries. And so they were all sort of working together and, and there wasn't a sort of hierarchy. And then slowly the studio system takes over. The talkies come in and movies really become big business, so suddenly it's money, it's so many different factors that push the women so much to this, to the margins again. But but initially it was really just an open kind of free-for-all. And also it was more for the working classes initially. It was just considered like tawdry entertainment. Movies started out being shown in between vaudeville acts and things like that. So, it's only slowly that it became a more desirable medium. And ironically, people like WEBer helped make it more respectable. And then as it became more respectable and bigger business, as middle-class people and upper middle-class people are going to the movies, then the women get pushed out more. So it was, it's a variety of factors, but that was part of it.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, it's really, really interesting. And it is very timely that that you're giving this talk the day after the Oscars. Actually, they're going to be doing the summary of the Oscars this evening, I think, the highlights of the Oscars. So Tom, shall I hand back to you?
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a great exchange there. I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm going to give this opportunity for anyone who has questions to please feed them into the chat. We've already had a few come through, and I'll just pick a couple out of what we've had so far and let other ones come in for about another 10 minutes or so. So the first one I've had come through is Helena, who asks about something that's actually carried on from what we were just discussing, is WEBer's recognition as a filmmaker during her lifetime. Now that the films have been slightly rediscovered, or at least sort of they're able to be seen again for the first time in a long time through release on home video and restorations and so forth. What was happening during her lifetime in terms of the recognition and reception of her work? Did she see not just commercial success but critical success in that regard?
Oh, absolutely. Well, it was a mix. I mean, she was regarded as one of the leading filmmakers, literally on par with somebody like D.W. Griffith for a while. So people talk about her in that company, but you have to keep in mind that in some ways her movies were more controversial. I mean, the movie that she made after this was The Hand That Rocked the Cradle. It was talking about celebrating Margaret Sanger and birth control. So some of these movies were quite risque for the message. There was another movie she made called The Hypocrites in 1915, which is actually available. And in that movie, you had the figure of truth walking around holding up this mirror to different people, trying to show how, the hypocrisy of these different characters. But the figure of truth was nude. And so she's walking around all through the movie. And so that movie, again, was censored. And then the other challenge is that in the United States, censorship was by state. So in one state like Ohio, she'd have to take out one scene for it to go to Massachusetts. It was even, another situation. To go to Europe was something else. So part of it was the message that she was conveying, and part of it was the imagery. So, but throughout all that, she kept managing to stay on top because she had this sort of demeanor that, this was this respectable lady. This was someone who was, well-spoken and always very, had this great persona. So people she was able to get away with certain things, I think, because of that kind of image that she was so careful to project and to nurture with the press. All accounts indicate that whenever she had interviews with people, it was always very controlled. Oftentimes she would even invite them to her house. And so she met them in this domestic setting to emphasize, again, her respectability and her, her sort of family orientation, domestic orientation. So, she was a very interesting character in the way that she was able to negotiate all these different forces at the time and still make movies that she wanted to make. I mean, these are pretty extraordinary when you watch them and think that she got through to the public, and people were, lining up to see these movies.
Yeah, it's amazing. An auteur, like you said in the talk, or like what we would think of as a sort of post-World War II construction, is something that can definitely be applied in this instance. I have another great question, which is from Mary Pound, which is a sort of inversion of this, is saying, is there instances where we can speak about the influence of the aesthetics of silent films on painting or on the visual arts at the time? And I know this is something that you've written about often in the past, so it'd be really interesting to hear some more about that sort of inversion of this.
Right. So I think part of the reason that, that we're able to find things about Sloan that would so closely parallel WEBer is because we know that through this period, from the time that movies were first shown in 1896, Sloan was in the audience actually writing reviews of movies. And we know we have his diary. He kept his diary and he said, dropped into this movie, dropped into that movie. So, I've tried to argue that that did impact not just his imagery, but even the sort of way he, patrolled the streets and looked in people's windows and things like that. So he's one example, but, George Lux, whom Francis mentioned, he actually was in vaudeville shows, and then, where movies were being shown. So a lot of these, the Ashcan artists were very well aware of movies. We know that people like Hopper, of course, that was also mentioned. He talks about this fact that he says, when I had a mental block with my painting, I went on a movie binge. So he goes out to the movies and he watches movies over and over, and watching these visual images just sort of flood over him, affects his paintings. So, in some cases they do the images of the movies, the actual like movie theater or the screen, but I think it also very strongly impacted their imagery. I mean, there's always that famous example that the scene from Hopper with that isolated house is compared to Hitchcock. So
the same frame is interesting, but then the idea, I think, also of like the dynamism of movement and blur and how that can become a part of, I mean, just not in the American context, but certainly in the avant-garde in Europe, the idea of movement in an image and containing movement within images is something that seems to feed in from cinema, especially with futurism and the Parisian avant-garde and Dada and surrealism certainly later as well. But okay, great. So I have one more question here, which is something that probably expands the remit slightly, which is Carol Smith asked about the influence of literature in this regard. So especially with novels like Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie and the subject matter that those sort of realist novels were taking on at the period, if that is something that enters into the dynamic of your thinking about these relationships.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was going to mention Zola. I had a whole connect thing about him too, because he writes about, the women in the department store in Paris. And, that certainly sort of gets the ball rolling in terms of, a lot of the themes in the movies from the 20s of the girl who falls in love with the manager and all that, the shop girl from the, relates back to that. So certainly it was realist literature. Dreiser, yes, very important. And as we saw, Lois WEBer is not only looking at Jane Addams and, more the socialist treatises, but she's also looking at short stories, like this short story that was in Collier's that sort of took that quote from Jane Addams and sort of fictionalized it a bit. So WEBer takes that and elaborates it much further for her movie. So yes, there's a great mix with literature. We know Sloan and many of the other artists too were their early careers, especially, they did a lot of illustrations for these realist novels. So they're very aware of the literature. And so really it's just layering upon layering, and it's just a matter of, separating out a few themes here for the moment, but it's very, very rich and almost like an excavation to find all these different themes.
Yeah, like an archaeology almost. That's in terms of, if there's anyone else has any more questions, they can fill it in now. I'll ask the question while we begin to wrap up. It might be the last questions if we don't see any more. But I really like the idea of the thing that you came back to at the end, the voiceless message of the films because of their silence. But then I thought about the idea of everything's being called the silent pictures, and the picture industry at that time is predicated on this idea of silence, though it never was silent, as you said. We have music and live accompaniment that's happening. But I was thinking about that, how this relates, silent pictures and voiceless messages, how that they relate to painting in some way. And I'm not sure if that's something that, it just seems like something that could be expounded upon. And I'm not sure if it's something you have further thoughts on as a sort of like a sort of system of thinking about silent movies and painting as being without a voice, but at the same time containing multitudes of, pluralities of voices.
Oh, absolutely. I think that they were all kind of relying on that, I mean, even from the very earliest times when they first started making silent movies, they would take a theme from the newspaper or a short story, something that people were already familiar with. Because someone like Edward Porter, when he first started making, short narrative movies, he didn't have all the techniques down of how one told a story in a moving picture. So he would depend on the fact that, as they said, a story was ripped from the headlines, or it was a familiar fictional story that allowed the audience to sort of fill in the gaps. And I think it's similar with the paintings, or we didn't even have time to talk about sculpture, but many of the sculptors too were fascinated by movement in the movies and used some of the same people that were in movies for their models and things like that. So, so it's kind of spirals out, but definitely this idea of the D.W. Griffith says, I want to make you see. So how do you convey a message visually? And that's what they were all basically trying to do, because they weren't really depending. When you watch a movie, when you watch any silent movie, you'll see there's a different style of the subtitles. Some people had a lot and they feel like they have to explain everything, and you're doing a lot of reading, but she really doesn't, and the best directors don't. So that whole idea of how do you convey that without a lot of verbiage, and that was something that someone like Sloan too, or Glackens or Hopper, all these people, it's the eloquence of that image that that they're hoping will speak to people in this way. And the fact that people who were going to the movies were also going to the art galleries means that they bring a certain ability to read images to both sides of the media.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a great answer to that. Wonderful. Thank you very much for coming, everyone, and thank you so much to both Francis and Catherine for an amazing session, a great talk and response, and a really great topic and lots of things to think about. So thanks so much. We will have another session on Thursday, actually this coming Thursday, the very short gap between them, in the Moving Image series, which are we talking at? So I'll plug myself. But thanks so much for coming today, and it's been a wonderful afternoon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Cheers.